Richard Burton's genius as an actor rises from roots that go deeply into humanity, and this explains the wide range of passions and ideas that come to life so vividly in the characters he portrays, especially Shakespearean characters. Consider his Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew, with his large, laughing, love-making, swashbuckling, extrovert, violent gentleness. Contrast that with his upsurging Hamlet, a man whose highly strung nobleness is so introverted in its suffering. The first and most important thing about Richard Burton, both as an actor and as a man, links with his immense human sympathies and generosities. He was one of the first in the field to give his services in aid of Aberfan, and again to Florence when the floods came. This is part of his personal approach to life. It is open and genuine. It doesn't come out of his acting comes out of it. He gives himself with understanding, and that is how and why he can play the great parts and interpret and ennoble them without sham. Another feature of his acting, which comes out of his own life, is his energy. His zest and vitality, coupled with passionate feeling, enable him to bring immense creative power to bear on his performances. This strength and the incessant impulses it gives out are under the entire control of his mind. His sudden lightning rages give the effect of unmastered spontaneity. He blazes, but in fact every gesture, every movement of the mouth and flash of ferocity in the eye, which seem to have this unbridled life force in them, are under control, and as exactly manifested as the movements of a great dancer, that is, with perfection of intention and achievement. When Richard Burton acts in front of a camera, the emotions that transform him on the stage come under an even stricter control. He quite deliberately reduces their scale, and if, as a director, you ask him why he is giving such a muted performance, so much less than you expected or had hoped to see, he will say, but remember what it will look like in a close-up on a screen when my face will be 20 foot high. And when you see the rushes of the film, you see that he was right. He knows the scale, and he controls the proportion. When he came to Oxford as an undergraduate in 1944, he had an astounding beauty, a blend of classic Greek serenity and smouldering Celtic fires emanating from mystery and humour, and above all, the fires of enormous laughter. His laughs have always been as infectious as his rages can be terrifying, and both are part of this masculine beauty and the humanity that gives his features their animation. Behind all, there is an element of Welsh Glendowerish magic or mystery to remind us of the unknowable things in life. But even more important than his looks is his voice. He is one of the great speakers of poetry. A critic wrote of his Hamlet in New York, which he did in modern dress, in 1964. He tastes his words, savouring them for delights and terrors, their sharp reverberations. His voice cuts the air, the sound of an English horn in its lowest range, the cry of a breaking trumpet above. I have just been working with him on the film of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, a play which contains two of the greatest speeches ever written for an actor to speak. One at the end of the play, as Faustus approaches midnight and his damnation, and the other when he sees Helen of Troy.
I believe you've always wanted to play this part, ever since you were a tiny child.
Well, I was actually, I think, about 12 years old when I first read and realized that I understood, or at least I thought I understood this particular play of Marlowe's, and particularly, of course, the last speech, which dominated and does still dominate my imagination. Whether we've realized it correctly, I don't know.
Can you tell me what were the differences between doing it on stage and on film? What were the advantages of filming it?
Well, there's no substitute, of course, for doing it on the stage. The immediate reaction of the audience who teach you how to act. They're the greatest teachers in the world. On films, it's very difficult because your only audience is a black box. However, we tried it and we use every possible effect, and we hope it'll be successful.
Now, Could we go back to 1944, when you had your first success at Oxford as Angelo in the Ards production of Measure for Measure? How did you get the part?
I was fairly ruthless when I arrived at Oxford, fresh from South Wales with a powerful Welsh accent and determined to play the leading part in whatever Ards production was coming out. Now, during the war, as you know, the Ards didn't exist, but there was a substitute company called Friends to the Ards, which was dominated and has been dominated for many years by Professor Neville Coghill. And I arrived and said, I'm an actor. I said, I'm an actor, and I want to play Angelo in your present production. And he said, well, I'm afraid it's already cast. And I said, oh, well, I'll speak some poetry for you. And he said, well, do go ahead. So I said, would you like to hear To Be or Not to Be? So he said, all right. And I spoke To Be or Not to Be, and at the end of it, he said, well, you can't play Angelo, but at least, is it all right if you understudy Angelo? And eventually, the man playing Angelo was so impressed by my earnestness that he said I should play half the performances and he would play the other half. And then he became ill. Nothing to do with me, nothing to do with the Welsh and wizardry. He became ill, and I played the whole thing all the time. That's how I began. I was assured a future from it by Binky Beaumont, Hugh Beaumont of H.M. Tennant, who saw it at the time, and John Gielgud saw it, I think.
But long before that, you must have decided that you wanted to act. How did that happen?
An advertisement in the Welsh papers which said that Emlyn Williams was looking for a Welsh man who could act and who was 22 and who could speak Welsh. And even though I was only 16 or whatever it was at the time, I said, well, I can speak Welsh, and I don't know whether I can act, but I had to go. Anyway, I got the part in this play called The Druid's Rest, and which I played for 10 weeks on tour, and then we arrived back in London, and nobody took the slightest notice of me at all, except one man, this James Redfern, writing, I think, in the New Statesman, who didn't think the play was very good, and he didn't think the production was very good or anything like that. But the very last line of his notice said, however, in a wretched part, Master Richard Burton, Master, you can imagine how much I loathed being called Master at that time, Master Richard Burton showed remarkable ability, and that was it. James Redfern changed my life.
After the war, you had a great success in two plays by Christopher Fry, The Lady's Not for Burning and The Boy with a Cart. John Gielgud directed them both. He must have been a great help to you at this stage in your career.
Oh, of enormous help. In fact, I could never repay him the debt that I owe him. First of all, he cast me in The Lady's Not for Burning, and then in the course of the play, in which I made something of a success, he then took me out of the play and put me into another play, The Boy with the Cart, which he directed again himself, and indeed made me into what is casually known as a leading man.
I once described Gielgud in print as the greatest living actor from the neck up, by which I meant that his most powerful attributes were his face and his voice. And I've often thought, do you think the same could be said of you?
No, I think it's not from the neck up, but from the brain down from here to here. I think that most of my capacity lies in my voice.
There was a speech in Boy with a Cart that you had a particular impact with. It started, I was alone by the unattended pillow. Would you like to do that for us now?
As you know, this is about this strange little saint, Cuthman, who was trying to build a church. The villagers and everybody who helps him, they can't put up the king post, the key post in the church. And he's left alone on the stage, and the other people go off, having despaired of building this church. And they come back, and it's in place. I was alone by the unattended pillar, mourning the bereaved air that lay so quiet between walls, hungry for hammer blows and the momentous hive that once was there. But gradually, I was aware of someone in the doorway, and turned my eyes that way and saw, carved out of the sunlight, a man who stood watching me, so still that there was not other such stillness anywhere on the earth, so still that the air seemed to leap at his side. He came towards me, and the sun flooded its banks and flowed across the shadow. He asked me why I stood alone. His voice hovered on memory with open wings and drew itself up from a chine of silence as though it had long time lain in a vein of gold. I told him, "It is the king post." He stretched his hand upon it. At his touch, it lifted into place. There was no sound. I cried out. I cried at last, "Who are you?" I heard him say, "I was a carpenter."
On stage, I've often thought that you seem apart from other actors, isolated, in a world of your own. Do you feel that yourself?
I've been told that by you and by some other critics, not as recipient as yourself. But nevertheless, quite clearly, I do feel that on the stage, it's virtually every man for himself. I don't think anybody wants to help you particularly, even despite the agonies of a first night and the nervousness and so on. You really have to look after yourself. And I think that particular loneliness, solitude, the idea of carrying on your own private room is not particularly unique to actors, that they all have it. I have it perhaps, or sometimes have it, a little more than most. When I go out there on the stage, I'm battling the world. I have to beat the world. I have to be the best as far as I can make it.
After Boy with a Cart, you had a very successful season at Stratford-on-Avon, in the course of which you played Prince Hal in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. What do you remember of those opening nights?
Nothing very much, except that I remember that I was nearly fired from Henry IV, Part 1, because in rehearsals, they didn't think that I was going to be very good as Prince Hal. I tried to explain that to the various people involved that what I was trying to do was to be exactly what you described, that is, to be solitary and removed and cold, and certainly not the thigh-slapping, stamping, roaring with laughter Prince Hal that we'd all been accustomed to. But I'm not sure that too many people understood it until the opening night. And I thought maybe I'd be fired after the opening night, but it so turned out that it was a great success for me.
Do you feel happiest when you're playing that kind of part, a man among men?
I'm the son of a Welsh miner, and one would expect me to be at my happiest playing peasants, people of the earth. But in actual fact, I'm much happier playing princes and kings. Now, whether this is a kind of a sublimation of what I would like to do or something like that, I don't know. But certainly, I'm never really very comfortable playing people from the working class.
You once said that Ferdinand and the Tempest was your greatest failure. Now, was that because it's a purely romantic role?
It's an unplayable role. If you happen to be rather shortish, as I am, tottering about with nothing to say of any real moment, bloodless, liverless, kidneyless, a useless member of the human race, I found myself incapable of playing such a role.
What I really meant was that whereas Henry the Fourth, the part there was a man who led an army and was a leader of men, in Ferdinand you had to play a lyrical part with a girl, and it seemed to me there might be something in your temperament that went for the one rather than for the other.
No, I can't play with girls. I can't
Why
play
is
with
that?
girls. But I'm not a romantic actor in that sense. It's perfectly all right. I think I'm recognized as sort of a sexual actor in some senses of the word. But Romeo, for instance, would... I've never played it, but beyond my capacity. Because the urge, the acting urge to kiss somebody on the stage is beyond me. I can't do it. Because, A, I can't bear to be touched, physically touched on the stage or on the screen. It has to be very carefully arranged. I really cannot bear to be touched, and I very rarely allow myself to touch other people, physically touch them, I mean.
Why is that?
I don't know. I don't know, but certainly it's something that doesn't apply to me. When I have to kiss a woman on the screen or on the stage, horrors start up, which is why I prefer to act with my wife than any other woman in the world.
I suppose Hamlet is the great untouchable part of all time, but would you like to give us your favorite bit of the part?
If there's any speech in Hamlet, I suppose that I would like to repeat, though Hamlet is so familiar to me now because I've played it so often as to become almost contemptuous. It is the speech, the prose speech, oddly enough, if I can remember it. I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercise. And indeed it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, seems to me no other thing but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. What a piece of work is a man. How infinite in faculty, in form, in moving, how express and admirable in apprehension, how like an angel in movement, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Now, I have an idea that probably I got a few words wrong in that, but that's where familiarity breeds contempt.
Well, you are familiar with it because after the 1953 Hamlet, you then repeated, or you gave another Hamlet in 1964 in New York, directed by John Gielgud. Did your performance or your interpretation differ?
Oh, enormously, yes. I think in the first time I played it as if I would like to be John Gielgud. And the second time I played it absolutely as myself. And in actual fact, I asked John Gielgud to direct it because I thought that despite his enormous influence on my life, because his personality and diction and speech patterns and behavior were so entirely different from mine, they couldn't possibly affect my particular thoughts about Hamlet at that time.
Suppose there had been a commanding theatrical institution when you began on stage, like the National Theatre. Would you have joined it on a long-term basis?
Oh, good God, yes, I would. Yes, if they paid me, if they paid me enough money to keep me alive. I mean, after all, the fundamental basis of being an actor is not the desire to be the curate's son, if you remember that quotation, but simply to make money. And therefore, if anybody asked me then, or indeed even now, to play in a theater which offered me a suitable arrangement of roles, I would unquestionably do it.
Now, was Gielgud, for example, a dominating director?
He was as dominating as a director could be, I suppose, with somebody like myself. I find directors, as we all know, the old cliche that the French theater is a writer's theater, and the British theater is an actor's theater, and the American theater is a director's theater. I don't believe any of them. The theater is essentially a writer's theater, and directors are relatively unimportant. They're not more than jumped-up stage managers. Films, it's a different matter. No, a director should tell you vaguely, roughly, the place on the stage where you will be best seen, and then, assumedly, leave the rest to you. John Gielgud, who is the best director I've ever worked with on the stage, certainly, was marvelously instructive about Hamlet, but certainly didn't dominate in the sense in the sense of saying, you must do this, or you must do that, or you must go there, you must do, because there were certain stern rules that I had for myself. A, don't come near me. You leave me alone. Which he understood. And I think he thinks that I'm a very undisciplined actor. For that very reason, I have to have a lot of space on the stage, a lot of space that I can move without being bothered by too many people. Well, John says I'm very undisciplined. He's probably right. But then I wouldn't want to be disciplined. I wouldn't want to be that kind of actor who goes on the stage and perfectly every night gives the same cadence to the same speech every night for days and days and days and days on end. I would prefer to be free, so that I'm invited to be bad some nights, if I happen to be bad that night.
Now let's go back to 1948. Your first film, The Last Days of Darwin. After all these years, what do you think of yourself?
Oh, no, heavens above, I would say lamentable. Thank God I never have to live through that again. But I never have to live up through those terrible years of postularity, of idiocy, of... I wouldn't like to go through that time again.
Is there a phrase you'd use to sum up your performance?
Febrile.
Febrile. What do you think of the films that you made for Fox? Films like My Cousin Rachel, Desert Rats, The Robe, etc.
My career with 20th Century Fox was somewhat checkered. I did some films that I enjoyed and wanted to do, and a lot of films that I didn't want to do. And there was no way of my persuading anybody that I wasn't right for them, or that the scripts weren't good, or that the setup wasn't right, or whatever. Not the most interesting period of my life from the artistic point of view.
A great many of the films were rather harshly criticized, but how self-critical are you as an actor?
Well, I have no self-criticism at all. I firmly believe that if people will pay money to see me in the theater or in the films, that's their responsibility and not mine. If they stopped seeing me, if my box office ratio went down or something like that, I'd be perfectly content to stop working. I do it because I rather like being famous. I rather like being given the best seat in the plane, best seat in the restaurant, the best food in that particular restaurant.
But if a film is a success with the public, do you criticize your own performance in it?
Well, it's very difficult because I rarely see any performance that I've been in. I did see Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf recently, and came out in what we say in Welsh as a tear. That is, I wanted to kill myself because I thought I was so indifferent. Not bad, indifferent in the part. But I was assured by everybody else, including the critics, that I was all right. So I've been solaced by that kind of thing. I don't think that it's a very good idea to see oneself in pictures.
Antony in the film of Cleopatra is essentially a defeated, passive anti-hero, especially in the second part of the picture. Do you think that kind of role suits you?
So I think the only kind of interesting parts to play are defeated men. That's why the great tragedies are so attractive, I think, to actors. One must always play a defeated man. The hero, the one who succeeds, is always faintly boring. Hamlet is a defeated man. Macbeth is a defeated man. Lear is a defeated man. They're all defeated men. Othello is. Iago is. And Antony fascinated me for that particular reason.
Jimmy Porter in Look Back in Anger was your first real anti-hero part. And you say that you enjoyed it. Now, could that be because it was so different from the other parts you played, the heroic parts?
Up to that time, as you know, I'd only played princes, heroes, kings, dressed eternally in togas or whatever. It was fascinating to find a man who came presumably from my sort of class, who actually could talk the way that I would like to talk.
You once said that you'd learned a great deal about acting in the cinema from Elizabeth Taylor. What did she teach you?
Well, I think the chief word is economy, a spareness of voice, of movement, of gesture, of agony, whatever the word is. She taught me that, I think.
Control.
Well, control, no, because that implies discipline. No, that's not right. But something very careful. You have to be very careful. It seems to me when your face, as she explains to me, is going to be 38 feet high, and depending on the size of your face, 30 feet wide, then you have to be very careful how massively you register any emotion of laughter, of idiocy, of delight, of tragedy, or whatever it is. She is, of course, the best film actress in the world, I think. You may disagree, and I may be prejudiced, but she certainly seems to fire all the time on all of her many cylinders.
Do you think that that sort of reticence in acting hampers you as a stage actor?
Well, no, I think it's the reverse. I think that on the stage, because I have an enormous voice, a very big voice, that is, on the stage it's so marvelous to be able to give free play to that organ, this particular organ. On the screen, I find it intensely difficult to try and keep it in, to control it.
In your recent films, I mean, let's say, Beckett, the spy who came in from the cold, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the scripts are much better than they used to be in the earlier films you made. Is this an accident, or because you've become more powerful as a determining force in the building of the film?
I think a combination of both, Ken. I think that as a result of my marriage to Elizabeth, I became a far more important actor than I was before, though it's not very easy for me to say that. And I think that Elizabeth became a far more powerful actress as a result of that stupid and stupendous publicity. But it did mean that we could choose absolutely what we did. Now, there were some things that we chose badly, but for the most part, we chose well. And I think, were it not for the fact that Elizabeth and myself were married and had been, and are perhaps, notorious or famous, Virginia Woolf would have been virtually unplayable. Nobody would have attempted to do it.
Did you think you were miscast in any way as the very neurotic, henpecked, downtrodden husband in Virginia Woolf?
Oh, yes, it's essentially miscast. In fact, I wasn't asked to play it until the last second, because quite clearly it should be an American. It should be an intellectual American from somewhere from the eastern states of America. And obviously I wasn't right.
Since 1960, you've only appeared on the stage 3 times. Do you miss that contact with a live audience?
No, I don't. The only thing I feel is that one of these days I have to go back and face that live audience. And I don't want to do it, but I must do it because I'm naturally a frightened man. And I must go back to face the audience because I'm frightened of facing the audience. Therefore, I must face them. It's one of those silly, perverse things.
Is there any great classical role you still long to appear in on stage?
Yes, only one.
Which one?
Lear.
And how soon do you think you'll be ready for Lear?
I think I'm already too old, but I think with a bit of luck, maybe in 5 years, if I'm controlled and kept under control.
Is there any great playwright whose work has never tempted you at all?
Brecht.
Why not Brecht?
Loathsome, vulgar, petty, little, nothing.
Large, poetic, universal, everything.
That's what you say.
Is there anything in the background of Wales, the cultural background, that specifically influenced your acting?
We had no actors, for about 40 years. I suddenly realized why we'd never had any actors, because all the actors, of course, went into the pulpit, the greatest stage in the world. You dominated a village in a chapel. You stood hovering like a great bird of prey over the people in the village. You said, I will tell you what is wrong with you, and let me examine your soul. The greatest pulpit in the world. And suddenly, that particular kind of belief went out. They were no longer stars, the great preachers of my childhood. They went out. And the first man in Wales to stop being a preacher and start becoming an actor was Emlyn Williams. And it was remarkable for all of us, There was this strange man who'd suddenly decided not to be a preacher, but to become an actor. And what a preacher Emlyn Williams would have made. Became a preacher in another sense.
Would it be true to say that the thing that drew you to the stage was rhetoric?
Oh, yes, unquestionably. And I think we have a word in Welsh called, misused, I believe, by you lot, called hwyl. And nobody can ever translate it, but it's a kind of longing for something, a kind of idiotic, marvelous, ridiculous longing.